No, so I just think in terms of priorities and like competing space, I think for the AOs and the large AOs, which are also EPAOs and actually doing quite a lot of EPA work, I do think they have genuinely found that a lot of added work and challenge to assimilate endpoint assessment into their into a business model, assuming perhaps it would be very comparable and very similar. And actually it's not. I mean, managing endpoint assessment, particularly when you get to volumes, logistically takes up an awful lot of resource. And it's a lot of resource, but there's also a lot of uncertainty. So I think, again, a lot of organisations are very stretched, aren't they, as well, on resource as well, because we're all trying to sort of like balance, you know, whatever size organisation you are at the moment, you're trying to balance the books. You're looking very carefully at your cash flow all of the time. You are thinking, well, what if as well? And I just think everything's just coalesced at the same time. I mean, it has been the perfect storm, but for so many people in further education and education generally as well. And yeah, I think it's going to take time to recover, but I do think it has put the digital skills back on the map. And however it got back on the map, and whatever they do, I think ultimately it's a good thing.
Absolutely. I think what's really interesting as well about what you've just said, Linda, is the fact that I think a lot of organisations hadn't really got their head around what endpoint assessment would look like. And so because they hadn't really got their head around what it looked like in sort of general operating terms, now this spanner has been thrown in the works and it's not as it should be. Again, they feel they're on a bit of the back foot. And it's interesting because I got a question fired at me. I can't remember, it was quite recently. And somebody said, well, what IQA processes do you need in place then? And I said, well, unless you've got an MVQ type qualification that is part of the whole framework within these standards, then none. And the good practice is being seen as checking to make sure that the quality of teaching and learning is as it should be. Your IQA, you haven't got anything to quality assure because there's nothing in a lot of cases that's going to be internally assessed.
And I suppose, and in some ways that's the challenge though, because I think you do need to do mock assessments to make an accurate judgment of readiness.
But it's a shift, isn't it?
Yeah, you need to do. I think the quality assurance is not so much checking necessarily on evidence, but it is checking on confidence, on readiness, on the apprentices and the employers' interpretation of those knowledge, skills, and behaviours, and how they're being met. So it's actually it's QAing. The learning, it is QA, and it is QAing the quality of the teaching and delivery, but it is also monitoring that progress. And I accept actually that is quite difficult to do because it is nebulous. So I think
different skill set, isn't it?
Yeah, I think good providers will take the knowledge, skills, and behaviours, and when they're devising their schemes of work, they will have a picture of, well, what would we expect them to be able to do at this stage? And if this skill says they must be able to do this, what does that look like in reality? You know, what would we expect them to do? So they almost have to do both a scheme of work, I guess, and like an internal specification.
Well, I think you've very much got to begin with the end in mind, haven't you, and work backwards. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. There has to be those crucial points that say, well, at this stage, we would expect X, Y, and Z. And also, I totally agree with you. You would expect, or I would expect, to be seeing practices of the assessments at various stages as well, and then cross-mapped against the knowledge, skills, and behaviours. Because without that, how is the learner going to know what progress they're making? How are they going to be able to get to the end and celebrate and confidently say, I can do X, Y, Z?
Absolutely. And I think actually the flexibilities have been interesting because we've obviously been working with assessment flexibilities, which have introduced, in some cases, a portfolio where a portfolio didn't exist. And I'm always slightly nervous about portfolios and synoptic assessment. But again, you can see those providers that have been doing that has been no issues about producing a portfolio of evidence. Those that haven't, it's like, and of course you can't go back in time. We haven't really got anything. So I think that is probably flagged for some quality assurance departments within training providers. Maybe we need to look at this again, and we need to reframe what we mean by quality assurance. I mean, equally though, the Ofqual technical report has come out this week, or last week, which was interesting as well, because it is saying, which is no surprise, on the sort of the first EPAs that they looked at, and those would be AO EPAOs, because the technical report is around standards that Ofqual actually are the EQA for, and pretty much the first EPAs would have been with the AO EPAOs because they were the first on the register. But again, you can see variances there, and I can see Ofqual moving to, and actually we as an EPAO do have a specification for each standard, for the very reasons actually the Ofqual report was almost saying, because sometimes assessment plans have gaps in them as well. I can see that being almost a requirement. There will be an assessment plan, but there will be a specification, and that I think will help people join the dots up a bit better. And
by
actually,
specification, do you mean like an amplification?
Yes, absolutely. So, and you know, they've used that example. Some assessment plans, for example, will say it's a 45-minute professional discussion and you must have 10 semi-structured synoptic type questions. So it's quite precise. Others don't give that sort of clarity as well. And that's when you can start to get variances as well, because it's been left to some interpretation as well. So I think the Ofqual technical report is quite interesting. I would also say it shows them as a regulator. I would like to say to Ofqual, you are the external quality assurance body or provider here. So what are you doing about it? What actions have you asked these EPAOs to take? And that, I think, as well, is still, it's sort of shifting grounds, because you've got this whole regulation EQA piece seems to be nuanced. So if it's Ofqual, they very firmly sit in the regulatory sort of side of things. But you look at some of the other EQAPs who are very much sitting in the external quality assurance side of things as well. And I mean, and we're all getting externally quality assured lots at the moment as well. So I still think there's uncertainties around that. And I think because it is so busy, people can only focus on so many things. So even, you know, training providers, no surprise, functional skills for the last 6-7 weeks has subsumed everybody, if they've not been furloughed. So I think again it just feels really
partly
full on in some ways, but
yeah, I think that was an issue, because more it was end testing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And because they haven't got the same kind of proof, if you like, for people to actually get to that point, because they're building them towards an end assessment, and there isn't all that other developmental evidence. And I think that's why it's caused such a big problem. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what you've said about the Ofqual and their findings, and I think as well the fact that there are quite a few fingers. Get my words out. Quite a few fingers in this same pie, and there's a lot. Ofqual are very experienced at doing this, but there's a lot of the external quality assurers that are not as experienced. And I think, do you think it makes a difference as well with when the standards and assessment plans were released? Or some of the older ones?
Absolutely, yeah. I think, you know, that the more current assessment plans are far more consistent and have, if you like, more relevant and valid detail in them. So that there's definitely you can see that, and you can see assessment plans have evolved, and actually again, it's not that surprising if you think about it, because people always assume that even trailblazer groups and employers had a very clear idea of what should go in an assessment plan. What they had a very clear idea was what they wanted somebody in that type of job role to be able to do. That is quite different from what should go into an assessment plan. And I think now the sort of groups are opened up to training providers and EPAO AOs. That has made a whole difference, because the early trailblazer groups, if I remember correctly, and my memory's not perfect, but it was actually very unusual for a training provider or an awarding organisation at that time to be present, or certainly to be present on a consistent
and they didn't
basis.
didn't really understand the structure of everything, did they? And I think that for me that was evident in some of the assessment plans, that, like you say, they knew what the job they wanted the person to do, but they didn't really know the mechanics of how that would be assessed. And I think as well, IF8, they were really on a massive learning curve as well, weren't they?
They were, and as were employers. And I do think there are some good things. I mean, I don't know every trailblazer group, but certainly trailblazer groups that I'm aware of or have worked with, actually it's been really quite positive to see employers that quite often would be deemed competitors actually being very collegiate and working together. And I think from an apprenticeship point of view, particularly with the introduction of the levy, it actually did get that employer buy-in more as well. So I think, you know, it supported that element of it. And I would not want to see us going back to where employers were not so actively involved in the creation of any standard or qualification, because I think there has been real benefit.
I've got some questions, because Erica suggested, you know, well, she asked what people wanted to talk about, and she suggested that perhaps we did some reflection, but nobody's come up with anything particular. And because she'd asked me to host this, I thought I've got some questions. So do you want to answer my questions?
I will. I'll do my best, Christine.
No, they're very relevant.
I'm sitting up straight now. I'm paying attention.
So we've got an interview going on, have we? Yeah. Well, they are quite relevant to the things that you've been talking about, and I think it'll kind of put it nicely in a little capsule. So the first one then is, have things started to shift for you? And if so, how?
They have started to shift in terms of it's quite manic, and the flexibilities are sort of in terms of endpoint assessment are understood. So we are certainly busier. In fact, my teams are really busy, but there's still an element, I think, of uncertainty, and still very much, well, but what if this, and can we do this, and when might this change as well? So I think things have started to shift. I think it slightly, again, depends on what sector you're working in as well, because clearly for some sectors, they've been extremely busy all the way through, but it has been, you know, they've been going to work every day, where you've got other sectors where actually they haven't been doing that. So again, it feels like sometimes you're in parallel universes almost, but they're traveling at slightly different speeds as well. So I think things have begun to shift. In terms for training providers, I would imagine, again, it's sectorally influenced, but I think starts are probably not where you would normally expect them to be, although this time of year is quite often a focus on completions. So I think we possibly need another couple of months really to see what the landscape looks like in terms of both registrations and attainment as well. And then potentially we need to say, well, you know, who and what worked well, and if we were having this sort of situation again, what do we need to do to make it perhaps less stressful in some cases. And
yeah, I guess as well that as things are starting to open up a bit, we're also seeing now that companies are announcing heavy redundancies. So that they are starting to forward think, but it's having this devastating effect on the economy, which, you know, we expected, didn't we? Okay.
Well, and we did, and I don't think we've seen the full thing. I was listening to a webinar last week, and they were saying it's like Wile E. Coyote, you know, at the end of the film, he's hanging on at the edge of the cliff for, you know, 5, 6, 7 seconds, and he said, I almost feel, you know, that the global economy is sort of at that point at the moment. We're hanging on to the cliff edge, but there is going to be a fall. And it will be interesting to see what that does to the apprenticeship market per se, because we've had the report out, haven't we, this week, that in some ways apprenticeships are not doing enough for social mobility. Well, I would say in part maybe that's an impact of the levy, because the introduction of the levy really wiped the SME market in many ways, and quite often it's the SME market that is more likely perhaps to, because they're local, smaller, to maybe support that as well. So it will be quite interesting to see perhaps how apprenticeships are supported, and if we could get perhaps the SME market more engaged again with apprenticeships. But I think we'll see probably the T levels will maybe level off some of those apprenticeships as well. But I think it's going to be an interesting marketplace, just generally vocational work.
So my next question then, which kind of brings that together, is how are you feeling about this next phase?
I don't know actually. I think I would say in some ways a little bit excited, and in other ways I think a little bit scared as well, because I think it's going to be such a change, and I think it will be interesting to see how people adjust to that as well. And I think there will be winners and losers out of that. So I'm sort of feeling in some ways, I suppose as well, a little bit sad, because, you know, great for the winners, but there are going to be some really good organisations or people or businesses that are losers as well. And it's how do we cope with that piece, and how do we reskill and re-educate that piece, and actually in some cases how do we build communities, because certain communities are going to really, you know, this is going to impact for years down the line as well. So I was doing something
the other day, and it involved looking at the PISA, the 2018 PISA results, and the fact that from the 2015 the UK had made a step forward with the maths and the reading, by quite a few points. Still a long way to go, but by quite a few points. And the next review is next year. And so that'll be really interesting to see the impact, because I think the impact on the young people who haven't been in school is going to be phenomenal. And I think that is something that's going to affect our sector in years to come massively, because there's no way there's no way. They've had nearly a year. By the time they go back in September with what they've lost and trying to regain that ground, I would say the impact is almost a year.
Yes, and it's not just the educational pieces. It's that whole engagement, socializing piece as well. Because what I wouldn't want to see is, you know, a generation, or, you know, a sort of a world where people are far more standoffish, are far more wary as well. And I think certainly in young and impressionable minds as well, that have got active and vivid imaginations, that there's quite a piece around that. So, you know, it's this whole emotional well-being piece. And again, I don't think we'll see the full impact of that. But again, there was a report, wasn't there, this week or last week, saying that it's the Gen Z people, generation, that have felt the most isolated during lockdown, although in many ways they are the most digitally astute as well. So I thought, that's quite a paradox in some ways. You would have thought that particular generation, so used to you know, communicating digitally have felt the most isolated as
Yeah, I
well.
wonder if that's because when they, in normal circumstances, they interact digitally through choice.
Yeah,
Yes, if they want to interact with people, they can do that, whereas the choice has been taken away from all of us. But the other comment you made as well about the distance thing, it made me think, well, actually, because I don't know about you, but when I was brought up, you, people weren't as touchy-feely as they are now. Men
no.
used to shake hands, but you didn't generally, unless it was close family, you didn't really hug people. But it became the norm that if you see somebody that you know really well and you like, you hug them, don't you? It
Mm.
almost more continental.
Mm.
And I think you're right. I think people will be much more wary about that now, and that distance and almost maybe that separation, that aloofness might start to creep in again.
Well, I think it's a difficult etiquette, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
almost a case of, should I be a meter? Should I be 2 meters? Um,
Should we
you know, you only have to go
elbow
around a
bump?
shop. Some have got masks on, some haven't. And again, it just seems people are
Yeah.
sort of trying to find their way, but I'm
No,
not
that's
quite
something
sure
else
almost how
that's
they should behave.
no, that's something else that's really struck me as well, because of all this thing that there was 2 or 3 years ago about women wearing burqas and not being able to see their faces.
Mm.
And now people are wearing face masks and you can't tell what's going on. You can see their eyes, but this part of somebody's face is quite an important part to be able to see.
Yeah.
And I think it struck me the other week that where we had this big thing about people's faces being covered at one point, now actually people's faces are being covered for protection.
Mm. Yeah.
Ironic, very ironic. Okay, so another question for you then.
Uh-huh.
So what do you see your new challenges to be?
Certain. I mean, again, I can only speak for our organisation. I think our new one of our challenges is to get that, if you like, the balance right within the company as well. So the balance right in terms of resources, how we resource, what we do, where we sort of, you know, put our effort and our energy. I think certainly as well for professional assessment. I think the other area that we're actually looking at is diversifying our standards. So in some ways we've always sort of prided ourselves on that, you know, we're quite specialist, we work in these particular sectors because we've got really good providence in these sectors. And I think we're now looking at branching out more as well. And I think so there's a challenge around there about getting in the right experts, the right product development, and a whole new learning piece as well, because you know you've got to do your research and really sort of know that. So I think for us it's that it's that keeping what's good but recognizing things are going to change and having a model that allows us to scale up quite quickly but is agile enough that we're not holding a lot of fixed cost.
Mm. I think that's going to be really important for a lot of people, isn't it?
Yeah.
And also looking at your costs and maybe the costs that you've saved over these last few months, whether actually those need to be put back in or whether there are ways to actually be more effective. And that, again, I guess that's going back to what we were talking about last week, wasn't it? About, you know,
Yeah.
hotel accommodation and travel, and should that money be rechanneled into maybe providing things like iPads or laptops or things for learners.
Absolutely. And I mean, I did ask my guys last week in a webinar that we were doing what they thought was working really well. And I did have a couple that were like, ooh, you know, technology. And they're going, gee, what's working really well is remote assessment. That's working really well. And I was going, okay, so what are we not liking so much? I'm not working portfolios. Okay. And I just thought that was really interesting because some of these people, I hope they won't mind me saying, but you know, they're like you know, like me, quite long in the tooth and have been round the block several times. And I thought that is really interesting because you've come from almost what I would call the portfolio generation, and suddenly you don't like that, but you're really getting into the remote assessment. But I think it's because they had to, Christine, and I really wonder if they'd had a choice, whether I could have got them to have made that change so quickly. And I think that's the other thing people are going to have to consider. We've been able to adapt digitally very quickly because we've had no choice.
Yes, absolutely.
As that choice or the possibility of choice comes back in, I think it could be quite foolhardy to suggest that any other, if you like, digital evolution or revolution will be so easy to get accepted, because we've had to accept it, because it's just been a mode of survival. It's either you do this or you just really can't function.
So I've got 3 more questions, and I'm going to give them to you all in one go, because they're kind of connected and they're linked to what you're saying now. So what are you going to do differently after this period of lockdown? What have you learnt, and what do you want to change?
Okay, so do differently. I think without a doubt, to utilise digital assessment wherever we can. So it will be our default. So unless, you know, there's no other way, we will be advocating to do digital assessment. What have we learnt as an organisation? I think we've learnt that we can be really very flexible. So we've had to, you know, readjust all of our assessments. We've had to fight and advocate for changes as well. We've all had to take on a much heftier workload as well. So I think we've learnt that we can do that, and people have sort of, you know, shifted and changed as well. So in some ways, again, the situation and the environment has allowed that. So but yeah, we've learnt that we can possibly do more and move quicker than we perhaps thought we could. What would we do differently? I think differently for me would certainly be, again, how we structure our resources as well, and maybe looking at the sort of behaviours that we want to demonstrate, but we also want everybody that works for our organisation to actually have as well. And I think the other thing is, we will be doing a lot more environmental scanning, because my view is we will be, well, what's going to be almost the next pandemic. So I think we will be temperature checking a lot more than perhaps we have done before, or paying more attention to that wider sort of, you know, macro piece of research, and really looking at legislation, really unpicking what's coming out of
when you say temperature checking, you mean that in the bigger piece, do you? Not the thermometers on the forehead kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah,
I think both internally and externally. I think that's the other thing, perhaps, and that's more from my personal level, because we are quite a small organisation, and we know, everybody knows each other by name, and we've worked together in some cases for a while, but perhaps there was that assumption that everybody was fine. And I think one of the things that this has shown as well, we've all made more of an effort to actually keep in touch and communicate as well. And maybe that's, for me, that's certainly another thing that I thought, I really need to keep doing this. Yes, I've had some great conversations with assessors, and I was just thinking, do you know, up until this, I wasn't talking to them, but I wasn't maybe having those sort of chats, or, you know, just a quick call, how are you, what's happening as well. Just everybody sort of was just getting on with it. And so as an MD, I thought, no, actually, it's really important to keep those connections going, and it's very easy to lose them because you get buried in other work that has to be done as well.
Absolutely.
So definitely would do that differently, I think.
So what about on a personal level then? Because I think, you know, we've been talking lots about business impact and changes and challenges and dealing with learners and stuff like that. But what about the people themselves that are been dealing with all this? And what about you? What sort of impacts for you? What are
Oh,
you
it's had a
personally
massive
taking away
impact on
from
me.
this?
And it's had a massive impact on me because I have had so much going on in my personal life since October. So to be honest, Christine, I had planned to take a lot of April and May out of work
Oh,
because
ouch.
yeah, I had planned to do that for really very, very good reasons. And clearly when all of this happened, I haven't been able to. So on a personal level, it's been incredibly draining because I've got obviously you know, a business that I want to keep going, and people that I respect and want to keep working with and keep their roles safe. And then I've had lots of stuff going on outside of work as well. So from that, I think, I'm almost like I need some time out. So I do feel as I've used all of my resources, but I'm sure again, lots of people in some ways have felt uh, like that as well. And I think I'm very mindful as well of those different challenges that people are facing as well. So I think again, I've learned more about certain people, because people, when you're in business, you do put on a facade. It's that whole thing, is it, how are you, I'm fine type thing. It does happen, it happens all of the time. And I think this time period has actually, maybe it's just within our organisation, but it's perhaps allowed people to reveal a little bit more of themselves, and ask for help. So last week I had some news, which was not great news, and I had promised my guys I was going to do some assessments for them. And I said, look, I'll absolutely do them. One phone call meant I absolutely couldn't do them. And they were just fantastic. It was just no questions asked. That's fine. We'll just take that off you. So I think, again, what I've seen is, and you sometimes have to be reminded that, is the generosity of people. And actually, 9 times out of 10, people are really brilliant and want to do the right thing. And as a leader, we just need to remember that and give them always the opportunity to do the right thing. And you can't do that sometimes if you're micromanaging. So I think that would be the other thing. Maybe I have found that less stressful because I've never been that sort of manager to micromanage. If you're good, just get on and do that. And I think maybe that's another area, perhaps, in terms of the new changes, if we are going to perhaps have a more blended way of working, is that leadership style, and really how do you lead from a distance, but keep that connection. And I think that's probably going to be a challenge, but
So
for some managers, others will naturally do it.
Absolutely. So when you sort of get to that place, because let me rephrase that. So you said you were going to take pretty much April and May out because you needed to. When do you feel that you'll be able to take that time out? And also, what kind of things are you putting in place to look after you, to help you get through?
I don't actually know when I'm going to be able to take time out, because it might have to be next week, because I'm not in complete control
of
that as well. So but I think ideally, if I can influence it in any way, and I won't be able to, but if I'm cut some slack, I would probably say I would want to see July through, because that'll give me a really good idea of where the land lies. I've got a really good team, so I know that they can keep everything going as well. But for me, next week's going to be quite a test, because I'll have an idea of the number of completions that have been processed, and I know how many we've got in EPA. So July is going to become quite a test for that. And if we can sort of do what we need to do, then in August I might say, actually, this is when I'm going to take some time out. And I'm very honest with my other fellow directors, so we're sort of aware of that as well. But so I would be saying maybe if I can, August, but it could be next week. So I'm having
But
to
if
sort of flex.
if you just sort of drop out and you don't have anything in place to help you, then can be this period, you know, it's like going back a few years ago when I was quite ill and going through lots of treatment, and then the treatment ended and it was like, right, okay, bye. And then it's that void, it's that, right, okay, what do I do now? So what kind of things are you thinking about putting in place to help you to be able to regroup, come back stronger? Because you're a very strong woman, so how would do you think you'll be
I
able to
suppose
do
it's I suppose in some ways it's always that adage, because my sort of family is scattered abroad as well, but it sort of comes back to what it often comes back to, you know, a few good friends and gin. No.
Woman after my own heart.
Yeah, so
Gin and
but
red
yeah,
wine.
it's a few good friends, and you know, trying physically to keep myself as healthy as I can and stuff as well, but also just in some ways being quite pragmatic about it. I think I've sort of learned that there are some things you just have to go with the flow with. You
Yes.
can't, you know, as much as you might want to change it, control it, mold it, you can't. And you have to ride the wave. And maybe that's what we've all got to do here as well. There will be some things that just, you know, across the piece we cannot change, but we know change is there, and we're just going to have to go with the flow. And you know, that's rather
I
than
think
swimming against the tide, you know, swim with it and see where it takes you.
absolutely. I think that has been a learning point for an awful lot of people, because, you know, we were in a situation, weren't we, where sort of about this time in March, it was announced, that's it, everything's been locked down. You need to stay in as much as possible. And then the following week, 10 days, we ended up with things like supermarkets restricting who went in, 2 meters everywhere, you know, lots of places being closed that you couldn't go to. And so we were almost then forced into a situation where we had no control. We didn't have the same choice. And it was being able to learn how to go with that and get through without there being too much challenge, as in like the physical, the emotional and all that kind of thing. And I think those people that have been able to manage that, they'll be able to take those skills forward, because you're absolutely right. We can't control everything, but we can learn from some of the things that have happened to us.
Yeah, and I think not beating yourself up too much as well. Inevitably, in all of this, mistakes are going to be made, you know,
Of course.
be it with, you know, marking or something like that, because there's been so much pressure and so much change. So I think it's also cutting people some slack as well, and you know, accepting that it has been challenging, and you know, things might have, you know, slipped through that in other times wouldn't have, but not because somebody can't be bothered, because you know they were, you know, drawn on to other things as well. So I think it's also around I think being yeah, a little bit forgiving as well, and accepting of things might not be perfect.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm mindful it's 11:15. So is there anything that you feel that, because people have been listening to these recordings, and I'll send it to Erica, I'll tell her that we had a private interview, but it has been nice. I mean, I think, and that's, I think one of the things for this time that we have had, and some of the things that you shared, because there is nobody else to contribute, it sometimes means that a lot more richer stuff can come out. And I think you've shared some really important insights. So is there anything else that you feel that you want to sort of share or point out on your reflections?
I don't think so. I think it's, you know, I think it's for all of us. We just have to, you know, it's taking each day, isn't it? As it comes. And I suppose for me now, one of the things I'm always going to do is plan for the worst and hope for the best. You know, that's sort of going to be my mantra, maybe my way of coping. And I guess we're all going to find and develop our own coping strategies, and probably form maybe different alliances and and different sort of groups and stuff. And I would not be that surprised if there weren't more groups like this as well, because I think in part that's a network. It's actually quite a good network sometimes to have, where you're not all in the same fishbowl. You've come from different fish bowls as well. But I think that sort of networking, I think, is really important, and I think we'll see more of that, and maybe more sharing of insights from people from different perspectives.
It could almost become a little bit of a mastermind group, because I think it's really useful to have different perspectives and different inputs, and when you've got a mix of strong voices, then that really does bring a richness. What's really interesting, something you've just said, and it took me right back to my Dale Carnegie days, which is, God, that's over 20 years ago now. One of Dale Carnegie's books was, I can't, forgive me if the title's not quite right, but How to Stop Worrying and Manage Stress. And one of his mantras with that was live in daytight compartments, and also to think, what's the worst that can happen? And almost once you know what the worst is can happen, then you prepare for that. And if that doesn't happen, then it's a bonus, isn't it? And that's just what you were saying. And those, those books were written in the 50s. So they've been things that have been standing the test of time. And I think that's a really important nugget that people can take away and think, yeah, actually, plan for the worst, because then we know we can deal with anything.
Yeah, and I think, that at an individual, business level, family level, whatever as well. So that will certainly be say my mantra, certainly at the moment anyway.
Yeah, well, I have a little 90% of what you worry about you can't change, and the other 10% there's nothing you can do about it anyway, so that's it, don't worry. Because the 90%, it never happens, does it? We worry
it doesn't as well. And I suppose that there is the other thing, isn't there, sometimes about self-fulfilling prophecies as well.
Oh God, yeah, big on that.
And it's certainly in markets and stuff as well. I always think you only have to look at the financial markets. You can talk a market up and you can talk a market down. It's actually quite often got very little to do with actually what's happening in business. It's about the story that you're creating and what stories are actually bought as well. And I think that's maybe the other piece for all of us working in apprenticeships is what's going to be the story moving forward, and what does that story need to be.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you for patching in today, and also a massive thank you for having your camera on, because otherwise I've been talking to a black space.
Even though my hair is like
will you stop it? I have to say, I've got a hair appointment on the 9th of July. God, I can't wait. It'll be so much better when I can get my hair done. But anyway.
But that's all part of it, isn't it? That's an important part of well-being and stuff as well. So you shouldn't knock it and stuff.
No, definitely. Well, it's been lovely to chat with you, and thank you again for dialing in today.
As well. So have a good rest of the day as well, and see you next week.
Yes, indeed. All right. Cheers, Linda.
Take care.
Bye.